I always knew my father favored Lucas, but knowing it and feeling it were two very different things. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, there were moments when the reality of it hit me like a brick to the chest. It wasn't just in the way he spoke to him. The way his voice carried a certain warmth when he addressed Lucas that was never there when he spoke to me, or the way his hand always landed on Lucas's shoulder in a firm, approving grip while mine was left empty at my side. It was in everything, the way he looked at him like he was proud before he even did anything worth being proud of, the way he brushed off my accomplishments like they were afterthoughts, the way he constantly reminded me, even without words, that no matter how hard I worked I would never measure up. I tried not to let it bother me, tried to convince myself that it didn't matter, that I didn't need his approval, that I didn't need to be seen or acknowledged or validated by a man who had never bothered to believe in me. But deep down, no matter how much I told myself otherwise, it did matter, and the worst part was that I hated how much it did. It burned in the back of my mind, gnawed at my self-worth, made every failure feel 10 times heavier because I knew, without a doubt, that he was waiting for me to fail, expecting it, counting on it. Lucas wasn't a bad guy, but that almost made it worse because if he were cruel or arrogant or openly dismissive of me, at least then I could blame him for the way things were. But he wasn't. He was charming and well-liked, effortlessly successful in the way that some people just were, the kind of guy who could walk into a room and have everyone's attention without even trying. He excelled in sports, had a talent for business, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been told he wasn't good enough. I envied him for it, envied how easy it all seemed to come to him, envied the way our father looked at him like he was the future of our family, while I was just the backup option no one ever needed. The night it all came to a head, the night that would change everything, started the same way every family dinner did, with forced politeness, the usual round of questions about work and life, and the unmistakable tension that came from years of unspoken resentment sitting between us like an invisible wall. My father sat at the head of the table as always, his presence dominating the room, while Lucas sat beside him, laughing at some joke I hadn't bothered to listen to, basking in the effortless ease of their shared understanding. I sat across from them, picking at my food, trying to push down the frustration clawing its way to the surface, knowing that eventually, something would be said that would make me wish I hadn't come at all. "So, Noah," my father said, his voice carrying that familiar edge of skepticism, that tone that made my stomach twist because I already knew whatever came next wasn't going to be good. "Still working that job of yours. What was it again? Something with computers." I clenched my jaw, setting my fork down carefully, refusing to rise to the bait even though I could feel my pulse quickening. "Software development," I said, keeping my voice even, knowing that no matter how I answered, it wouldn't be the right response. He hummed, nodding like I had just confirmed something he had already suspected, before glancing at Lucas with a smirk. "You know, Lucas just closed another deal last week, big contract, real estate development, solid future in that, something with actual longevity," he said, the dig so thinly veiled it was almost laughable. "Meanwhile, all this tech stuff, it changes so fast. Who knows if it'll even be around in 10 years. Lucas gave a small chuckle, shaking his
Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
Head as if he were embarrassed by the attention, but I could see the satisfaction in his eyes, the way he thrived under our father's approval, the way he always got to be the one who was praised while I was the one being dismissed. I could have let it go. I should have let it go. But something inside me snapped, something that had been waiting for this exact moment, something that had been building for years, and before I even knew what I was saying, the words were already out of my mouth. "One day, I'll be more successful than Lucas," I said, my voice steady, my hands tightening into fists beneath the table, my gaze locked onto my father's, daring him to challenge me. For a split second, the room was silent, a brief moment where no one spoke, no one moved, where my father simply stared at me like he couldn't believe I had just said that, like the idea of me surpassing Lucas was so absurd it didn't even warrant consideration. And then he laughed, loud and genuine, a deep belly laugh that made my face burn with humiliation, that made my skin crawl, that made every insecurity I had ever tried to bury come roaring to the surface. Lucas chuckled too, shaking his head, amused but not surprised, like he had heard a child say they wanted to be an astronaut and was indulging the fantasy for a moment before reminding them of reality. "Oh, kid," my father said, still grinning, wiping the corner of his eye as if I had just told the funniest joke of the night. "That's cute. Really. But let's be honest here, all right? You work on little apps, Lucas builds empires. There's no competition." I felt my nails digging into my palms, my breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts, my vision blurring at the edges as the laughter echoed in my ears, bouncing around in my skull, carving itself into my memory like a scar that would never fade. I pushed my chair back, standing so quickly the legs scraped against the hardwood, the sound cutting through the laughter, cutting through the air between us, cutting through whatever fragile thread had been holding me here all these years. "You'll regret this," I said, my voice shaking but firm, my hands clenched at my sides, my chest heaving with the force of everything I wanted to say but couldn't, wouldn't, didn't need to. Because one day I would prove them wrong. One day I'd be the one laughing. And when that day came, they would finally understand what it meant to underestimate me. The night I left my father's house, the cold air felt sharper than usual, biting against my skin as if the world itself was testing me, reminding me that whatever came next wasn't going to be easy, wasn't going to be forgiving, wasn't going to wait for me to catch my breath before throwing the next punch. I had nowhere to go, no safety net, no plan beyond the one promise I had made to myself as I walked out that door with my father's laughter still ringing in my ears. I was going to prove them wrong, no matter how long it took, no matter how much it cost me, no matter how many nights I had to spend wondering if I had made the biggest mistake of my life. I found a small apartment in a part of the city most people avoided after dark, the kind of place where the walls were thin, the heat barely worked, and the water pressure was unpredictable at best. The first time I stepped inside, the reality of what I had done hit me like a freight train, the weight of my decisions settling into my bones as I dropped my duffel bag onto the scuffed wooden floor and looked around at the tiny, empty space that was now my home. There was no furniture, no decorations, nothing that made it feel like a place someone actually lived, but for the first time in my life it was mine, and that had to be enough. I picked up whatever jobs I could find, anything that paid enough to keep the lights on and food in the fridge, anything that kept me moving forward, no matter how exhausted I was by the end of the day. I worked shifts at a warehouse loading boxes until my arms ached, spent long nights cleaning office buildings when the city was asleep, picked up freelance coding gigs that barely paid enough to be worth the effort. Every dollar I earned was stretched thin, every bill was paid at the last possible moment, every meal was carefully planned so that I wouldn't run out of groceries before the next paycheck came in. Meanwhile, Lucas was thriving, living the life my father had carved out for him, stepping into opportunities that had been handed to him without hesitation, without question, without struggle. I saw the photos he posted, the expensive suits, the luxury vacations, the brand new car that my father had probably bought for him without a second thought. I heard about the deals he was closing, the investments he was making, the empire he was building while I was barely scraping by, barely keeping my head above water, barely surviving. But I didn't let it break me. Every late shift, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt only made me more determined, more focused, more desperate to claw my way out of the hole I was in. I taught myself everything I could about coding, about business, about the industry I wanted to break into. I spent every spare second watching online tutorials, reading books I borrowed from the library because I couldn't afford to buy them, practicing until my eyes burned and my fingers ached. I took on projects that underpaid me, worked with clients who demanded more than they were willing to give, built a portfolio with nothing but grit and the sheer, unshakable belief that this was only temporary, that one day all of this would mean something. There were nights when I questioned everything, nights when I stared at my computer screen with my bank account showing single digits and wondered if I had made a mistake, if I had thrown away my only chance at stability because of pride, because of stubbornness, because of a desperate need to prove a point. There were moments when the weight of it all felt unbearable, when the loneliness crept in, when the exhaustion settled so deep into my bones that I didn't know if I could keep going. But then I'd hear my father's voice in my head, hear the way he had laughed, the way he had dismissed me like I was nothing, like I was never going to be anything. And suddenly, the exhaustion didn't matter, the doubts didn't matter, the struggle didn't matter. Because I wasn't doing this just for myself. I was doing it for every time I had been told I wasn't enough, for every moment I had been made to feel small, for every second I had spent watching Lucas live a life that should have been mine. I pushed harder, worked longer, learned faster. I started networking, sending out emails to anyone who would listen, cold calling businesses, reaching out to people who had made it, studying their successes, analyzing their failures, absorbing every lesson I could find. And then, one day when I least expected it, everything changed. It happened in a coffee shop, the kind of place where people sat with laptops and notebooks, where the air smelled like burnt espresso and overworked ambition. I was sitting at a corner table, exhausted from another all-nighter, working on a project that would barely pay my rent, when a man in his late 40s sat down across from me without asking. His sharp eyes scanning my screen before he spoke. "You built that?" he asked, his voice calm but direct. His suit too expensive for a place like this. His presence commanding in a way that made it clear he wasn't just anyone. I nodded, unsure of where this was going, unsure of who he was, unsure of why he was suddenly interested in the lines of code flickering on my screen. "Not bad," he said, tapping his fingers against the table. studying me like I was a problem waiting to be solved. Needs some refinement, but you've got talent. You work for yourself. I hesitated, not wanting to admit how little I actually had, not wanting to reveal just how much I was still faking my way through this. But something in his expression told me he already knew. For now, I said, choosing my words carefully, keeping my voice steady even though my heart was pounding. He studied me for another long moment before he nodded, pulling out a business card and sliding it across the table. Call me when you're ready to take this seriously, he said, standing up before I could respond, before I could even wrap my head around what had just happened. I picked up the card, turning it over between my fingers, my breath catching as I read the name. Daniel Mercer. I had spent months studying his career, reading about the companies he had built, the industries he had revolutionized, the way he had started with nothing and turned it into something unstoppable. He wasn't just successful, he was one of the most powerful entrepreneurs in the industry. And now, for some reason I couldn't quite understand, he had just given me an opportunity one never could have imagined. I sat there for a long time, staring at the card, feeling the shift in the air around me, knowing without a doubt that this was the moment everything changed. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was about to start winning. Success never happens overnight, no matter what people like to believe. And for me, it was a slow, grueling climb filled with endless setbacks, long nights, and a constant gnawing fear that no matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I sacrificed, I still might not make it. But after that first meeting with Daniel Mercer, something inside me shifted. Something clicked into place in a way I couldn't quite explain, like the gears of my life were finally turning in the right direction, like I had been waiting for this moment longer than I even realized. He didn't offer me a job, didn't hand me success on a silver platter like my father had always done for Lucas. What he did was much more valuable. He gave me an opportunity, a single chance to prove that I was worth investing in, and that was all I needed. At first, it was small projects, nothing glamorous, nothing that screamed overnight success, but they were steady, they were real, and most importantly, they were mine. I built software for companies looking for efficiency, streamlined systems for businesses that had been operating on outdated models, and within months, I started to see the shift. More emails, more calls, more people recognizing my name. I worked harder than I ever had before, barely sleeping, barely taking a second to breathe, pushing myself past exhaustion because I knew what was at stake, knew that if I slowed down even for a moment I might lose everything I had spent years trying to build. Meanwhile, Lucas and my father still acted like I didn't exist, still brushed me off like I was the same failure they had always seen me as, still went about their lives as if I was stuck in the same place I had been when I left. It was almost funny, the way they assumed nothing had changed, the way they never bothered to check, never thought to ask, never even considered the possibility that I might be doing something more than just barely scraping by. I had learned to stop looking for their approval, had taught myself not to care whether or not my father ever saw me as anything more than an afterthought, but some part of me, some deep, buried part one hated to admit even existed, still wanted the moment, still wanted the satisfaction of proving them wrong in a way they could never ignore. And then, it happened. One deal. One contract that changed everything. It came unexpectedly, an opportunity so big that for a moment, I almost thought it was a mistake, almost thought someone had sent the email to the wrong person, almost couldn't believe that after years of struggle, after years of fighting to be seen, I was finally standing on the edge of something real. A company, one of the biggest in the industry, one that had been around longer than I had been alive, wanted me to design and implement a system that would overhaul their entire operation, something that would put my name in places I had only ever dreamed of reaching, something that would take me from promising newcomer to undeniable success. I remember staring at the contract, reading over every line, feeling the weight of it in my hands, knowing that if I said yes, if I took this risk, if I stepped through this door, there would be no going back. I signed my name without hesitation, not because I wasn't afraid. I was terrified, but because I knew deep down that I had spent my entire life waiting for this exact moment. The months that followed were a blur of high-pressure meetings, sleepless nights, impossible deadlines, and a level of stress I had never experienced before. Every second of my time was accounted for. Every move I made had consequences. Every decision felt like it could either launch me further into success or drag me back down into nothingness. I barely ate, barely slept, barely did anything that wasn't directly tied to the business, because I couldn't afford to fail, couldn't afford to let doubt creep in, couldn't afford to let them be right about me. And then, before I even had time to process it, I was there. I had made it. My name was in articles. My company was being talked about in rooms I had never thought I'd step into. My work was being recognized on a level I hadn't even dared to imagine. The money came fast, the opportunities even faster, and suddenly, everything I had spent years struggling for was mine. But success, as I quickly learned, comes with a price. The more I gained, the more I lost. Little pieces of myself slipping away in the chaos, in the long hours, in the constant need to be more, do more, achieve more. I told myself it was worth it, told myself that this was what I had always wanted, told myself that I was simply doing what it took to stay ahead. But there were moments, brief, fleeting moments, where I caught my reflection in a darkened office window at 3 a.m. and didn't recognize the person staring back at me. I missed birthdays, ignored phone calls from old friends, let relationships fade into the background because there was always another meeting, another deal, another opportunity that I couldn't afford to pass up. My life became a series of transactions, a constant game of winning and losing, of taking and giving nothing back, of climbing higher and higher without ever looking down to see what I was leaving behind. And still Lucas and my father had no idea. They were living in their own world, too wrapped up in their own success, too confident in the idea that I was still beneath them to even bother checking. I could have reached out, could have forced them to see what I had become, could have shoved my success in their faces just to watch the realization sink in, but I didn't. Because it wasn't enough for them to hear about it, I wanted them to feel it, wanted them to experience what it was like to underestimate someone and be proven wrong in the worst possible way. So I waited. I let them live in their ignorance, let them continue believing I was nothing, let them keep their comfortable illusion intact. Because I knew something they didn't. I knew that the day was coming. The moment when everything they had built, everything they had taken for granted, everything they had assumed was untouchable, would come crashing down around them. And when that moment arrived, when they finally saw me for what I had become, when they finally realized that the power they had always held over me was gone, I wanted to be standing there, watching. Because nothing in the world was going to be more satisfying than seeing the look on my father's face when he realized that the son he had spent his whole life doubting was now the only person who could save him. Success can make a man blind, but arrogance will make him reckless, and Lucas had always been both. He carried himself like someone who could never lose, like failure was something that only happened to other people, like the world would always bend in his favor because it always had, because our father had made sure of it, because every mistake he had ever made had been swept under the rug before it could touch him. He had never learned what it meant to struggle, had never been forced to claw his way up from nothing, had never spent nights lying awake wondering if he could afford to keep the lights on for another month. He had only ever known success that was handed to him. And when you've never had to fight for something, when you've never had to earn it, you don't know how to keep it when things start to go wrong. It started small, the way most disasters do, just a few miscalculations, a couple of bad investments, a few overly ambitious projects that didn't turn out the way Lucas had expected them to. He was trying to expand too quickly, throwing money at opportunities without thinking them through, taking risks without considering the consequences, but for a while he got away with it. People still believed in him, still trusted him, still saw him as the golden boy with a Midas touch, still assumed that everything he touched would turn to gold. And for a while he believed it too, convinced himself that the losses were just temporary setbacks, convinced himself that things would turn around, convinced himself that he was too smart, too powerful, too connected to fail. But money runs out faster than confidence, and when the cracks started to show, when the investors started pulling back, when the numbers stopped making sense, the empire Lucas had built on his own arrogance began to crumble beneath him. He made desperate moves, tried to buy time with more reckless decisions, convinced our father to invest even more money, convinced him that everything was under control, convinced him that they just needed one more deal to turn things around. But the truth was, Lucas had no idea how to fix what he had broken, and by the time he realized how deep he was, it was already too late. David, for all his self-proclaimed business genius, should have seen it coming, should have known better than to keep throwing money into a sinking ship, should have recognized that Lucas wasn't the flawless businessman he had always believed him to be. But he was blinded by pride, by loyalty, by the same arrogance that had always kept him from seeing the truth, and instead of cutting his losses, instead of taking a step back and accepting reality, he doubled down. He poured everything he had into Lucas's failing projects, convinced himself that his son couldn't fail, convinced himself that if he just believed hard enough, if he just kept throwing money at the problem, it would all work out in the end. And then it all came crashing down. The company folded almost overnight, the debts piling too high, the investors pulling out, the deals falling apart, the carefully constructed illusion of power and control shattering under the weight of reality. The family home, the one Lucas had grown up in, the one that had been passed down for generations, was foreclosed without ceremony, the doors locked, the furniture sold off piece by piece to cover the endless debts. The bank accounts were drained, the luxury cars repossessed, the vacations cancelled, the expensive suits replaced with worn-out desperation. Lucas and David, the two men who had spent their lives believing they were untouchable, found themselves standing in the ruins of everything they had built, watching as the world moved on without them, watching as their names became cautionary tales whispered in backrooms and business meetings, watching as the people who had once admired them now pretended not to know them. And just like that, the golden son and his father, the man who had laughed in my face, the man who had never believed in me, were left with nothing. At first, they tried to fix it, tried to salvage what was left, tried to convince themselves that this was just a rough patch, that things would turn around, that they would find a way back to the top. But the world had a cruel way of moving forward without waiting for those who had fallen behind. And as weeks turned into months, as rejection after rejection piled up, as every attempt to rebuild was met with closed doors and unanswered calls, reality finally set in. There was no coming back from this. And when they had nowhere else to turn, when every bridge had been burned, when every so-called friend had abandoned them, when they were standing at the edge of a life they no longer recognized, they finally did the one thing I had been waiting for them to do. They came looking for me. It started with a phone call, an unfamiliar number flashing across my screen, one I almost ignored until something in my gut told me to answer, something deep and instinctual, something that whispered, "This is it." I pressed the phone to my ear, waiting, silent, letting the weight of the moment settle between us before I spoke. "Noah." My father's voice came through, quieter than I had ever heard it, lacking the usual authority, lacking the usual condescension, stripped of the power he had once held over me. "We need to talk." I could have laughed, could have thrown his words back in his face, could have reminded him of the night he had laughed at me across that dinner table, the night he had dismissed me like I was nothing, the night he had made it painfully clear that he thought I would never be more than a failure. But instead I let the silence stretch, let him feel the weight of what he was asking, let him understand, even if just for a moment, that the balance of power had shifted, that he was no longer the one in control. "Why?" I asked, my voice calm, measured, controlled in a way I knew he would recognize, in a way I knew would remind him that I wasn't the same man who had walked out of his house years ago. There was a pause, a hesitation, a moment of silence so thick I could almost hear the words he was struggling to say, the pride he was trying to swallow, the desperation creeping into his voice when he finally answered. "Because," he said, and for the first time in my life, I heard something in his voice I had never heard before. "Defeat." I let out a slow breath, let the satisfaction of the moment wash over me, let the years of resentment and anger settle into something colder, something sharper, something that whispered, "Now you know what it feels like." But instead of answering, instead of giving him what he wanted, instead of letting him off the hook so easily, I let the silence stretch once more, let him sit in the discomfort, let him understand that this time he was the one waiting on me. And when I finally spoke, when I finally let him hear the decision in my voice, the weight of everything I had built, the power I now held, I made sure he knew, without a doubt, that the boy he had laughed at was gone. "I'll think about it," I said. And then, without another word, I hung up the phone. I had spent years imagining what it would feel like to hear my father admit defeat, had pictured the moment over and over again, had replayed the memory of his laughter at that dinner table so many times that it had become a permanent scar in the back of my mind. But nothing could have prepared me for the way his voice actually sounded when he called me. Nothing could have prepared me for the emptiness in his tone, the quiet resignation, the absence of the authority that had once controlled every conversation between us. He had always spoken like a man who expected to be obeyed, like someone who assumed the world would bend to his will. But now, for the first time in my life, I could hear something I had never heard from him before. Desperation. I let him talk, let him stumble through the excuses, the half-hearted attempt to act like this wasn't what it obviously was. Let him avoid saying the words he didn't want to say, but I didn't interrupt. I wanted him to struggle, wanted him to feel every second of the humiliation, wanted him to understand that no matter how he tried to dress it up, no matter how much he wanted to make it sound like a mutual discussion, I knew exactly what was happening. He wasn't calling to check in, wasn't calling to reconnect, wasn't calling because he had suddenly realized that he had a son worth acknowledging. He was calling because he needed something. "Your brother and I have been going through a bit of a rough time," he said. His voice strained. His words carefully chosen, still clinging to whatever pride he had left, still trying to control the narrative even as it slipped through his fingers. "I figured we should talk." I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window of my office, taking in the city skyline stretching out before me, the view from the top that I had earned with every long night, with every sacrifice, with every ounce of pain and determination that had brought me here. It was almost poetic, the way things had come full circle, the way the man who had once dismissed me now needed me, the way the brother who had once looked down on me was now begging for a chance to be in my position. "What exactly do you want to talk about?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral, controlled, offering him nothing, refusing to make this easier for him. There was a long pause, the kind that spoke volumes, the kind that let me know he was trying to find a way to say what he needed to say without choking on the words, without acknowledging the full extent of his downfall. "Lucas needs a job," he said finally. And if I hadn't already known where this conversation was going, that sentence alone would have knocked the air from my lungs. Things didn't work out the way he expected, and I told him you might be able to help. I almost laughed, almost let out the kind of bitter, unrestrained laughter that had been building in my chest for years, the kind that would have mirrored the way he had laughed at me that night, the kind that would have made it clear just how much I was enjoying this moment. But I held it back, forced myself to stay quiet, forced myself to let him sit in the silence, forced myself to let him feel just how ridiculous it was that he thought he could call me after all these years and expect me to clean up the mess that he had helped create. "You're asking me," I said slowly, drawing out the words, making sure he felt every ounce of weight behind them, "to give Lucas a job?" There was another pause, another hesitation, another breath that told me exactly how much it pained him to be in this position, exactly how much it killed him to need me when he had spent so much of his life making sure I knew that he didn't. "Yes," he admitted, and there it was. The moment I had been waiting for, the moment when he finally had to swallow his pride, finally had to acknowledge that I had become the one with the power. I didn't answer right away, didn't offer him anything, didn't let him off the hook, because I wanted to stretch this moment out for as long as possible, wanted him to sit in the reality of what he was asking, wanted him to understand exactly what it felt like to be on the other side. "Tell you what," I said finally, keeping my voice calm, almost amused, letting the satisfaction bleed through just enough for him to hear it. "I'll think about it." I could hear the tension in his silence, could practically feel the frustration radiating through the phone, but he didn't push, didn't argue, didn't try to demand anything, because for the first time in his life, he didn't have the power to demand anything from me. We set a time to meet, a neutral location, somewhere public where he and Lucas could pretend this was just a business discussion and not the last, desperate attempt of two men who had lost everything. I could have refused, could have told them both to rot in the grave they had dug for themselves, could have left them in the same oblivion they had left me in for years, but something inside me, some deep, cruel part of me that still wanted them to see me, to recognize what I had become, needed to do this face to face. The day of the meeting, I walked into that restaurant like a man who had nothing to lose, like someone who knew he was the most important person in the room, like someone who had spent his whole life waiting for this moment and wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers. Lucas was already there, sitting stiffly across from my father, his shoulders tense, his expression carefully neutral, but I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of failure hanging heavy around him. He wasn't the same man he had been the last time I saw him, wasn't the arrogant, untouchable brother who had once sneered at my ambition, wasn't the golden son who had never doubted his place in the world. He looked smaller, somehow like he had been chipped away piece by piece, like he had finally learned what it meant to be on the outside looking in. David, for his part, had aged in a way that had nothing to do with time. His confidence gone, his once powerful presence diminished. His eyes filled with something that almost resembled regret but not quite enough to be real. He was still holding on to something, still clinging to the idea that he could control this situation, still refusing to fully acknowledge that he was sitting across from the one person he had spent his entire life underestimating. I took my time sitting down, took my time meeting both of their eyes, took my time enjoying the moment for exactly what it was. "So," I said, leaning back in my chair, watching as my father shifted uncomfortably, watching as Lucas avoided my gaze, watching as the two men who had once dismissed me now waited on my decision. "Let's talk about your future." And for the first time in my life, I was the one calling the shots. Sitting across from my father and stepbrother, I felt something shift inside me, something that should have brought me satisfaction, something that should have made this moment feel like the victory I had been chasing for years, but instead, there was a strange emptiness curling at the edges of my mind. The two men who had once towered over me, who had once treated me like I was insignificant, like I would never amount to anything, now sat in front of me looking like shadows of the people they used to be. My father, once so confident, so sure of his place in the world, so certain that Lucas was destined for greatness while I was nothing more than a footnote in his life, now had the worn-down look of a man who had lost everything and had no choice but to acknowledge it. Lucas, who had spent his whole life coasting on talent and charm, was no longer the golden son, no longer the one with all the answers, no longer the one who held the power in any room he walked into. I wanted to enjoy it, wanted to relish the way they avoided my gaze, the way their shoulders carried the weight of their failure, the way the arrogance that had once been so deeply ingrained in them had been stripped away by the harshness of reality. But instead, I felt a strange, quiet unease creeping into my chest, a nagging voice in the back of my head whispering that this moment didn't feel as good as I had expected it to. My father cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his seat, his hands folded tightly on the table in front of him, his fingers tense, as if he was fighting the instinct to maintain control of the conversation. "I won't waste your time," he said. His voice lower than usual, lacking the authority it had always carried, sounding almost unfamiliar now that the certainty had been drained from it. "Lucas needs a job, and I thought, given everything, you might be willing to help." The word sat heavy between us, stretching out into the silence, filling the space with an unspoken history that neither of us could ignore, a past filled with dismissals, with laughter, with a quiet certainty that I would never amount to anything. I studied him carefully, waiting for the usual condescension, waiting for the inevitable attempt to twist the situation in his favor, waiting for him to find some way to reassert his control, but there was none. This wasn't a power play, wasn't a manipulation. This was real. Lucas kept his head down, his jaw tight, his hands resting on the table but clenched into fists, his knuckles white. He had always been the kind of man who could talk his way out of anything, who could charm or negotiate or strategize his way into getting what he wanted, but there was nothing left for him to leverage, nothing left for him to trade. He had no position of power anymore, no reputation to uphold, no safety net to fall back on. For the first time in his life, he had to ask for something without the expectation that he would get it. I let the silence stretch a little longer, let them both sit in the discomfort, let them feel the weight of the moment, let them understand that I wasn't going to make this easy for them. Then finally, I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, tapping my fingers against the edge of the table as I met my father's gaze with the same steady confidence he had once used to make me feel small. "You didn't believe in me," I said, my voice calm, measured, devoid of emotion but carrying every ounce of truth that needed to be spoken. "You told me I would never be more successful than Lucas. You laughed in my face. You didn't just doubt me. You made sure I knew that you thought I would fail." My father's face didn't change, but I saw it in his eyes, saw the way my words hit him, saw the way he knew there was no way to deny it. He had never been the kind of man to apologize, had never been the kind of man to admit he was wrong, had never been the kind of man to acknowledge his mistakes. But now, sitting across from me, he had no choice. "I was wrong," he said, and the words came out slow, careful, like he had never spoken them before, like they were foreign in his mouth, like they tasted bitter. "I see that now." Lucas finally looked up at me. His expression harder to read, a mixture of regret and frustration and something else, something that looked dangerously close to shame. "I get it," he said, his voice quiet, rough, lacking the smooth confidence he had always carried. "You have every reason to say no, every reason to let us fall. And if I were in your position, maybe I would do the same thing. But I'm asking you not as someone who ever thought he was better than you, not as the guy who had everything handed to him, but as someone who finally understands what it means to lose everything. I'm not the same person I used to be, Noah. And I don't expect you to believe that, but I do expect you to understand what it's like to need a second chance." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to remain still, forcing myself not to let his words get to me, not to let them reach the part of me that remembered what it felt like to be the one on the outside, to be the one struggling, to be the one desperate for a way forward. 'Cause he was right. I did understand. I had spent years hating them, had spent years using that hatred as fuel, had spent years convincing myself that if this moment ever came, I would let them burn. But now that it was here, now that I had them sitting across from me, stripped of their pride, stripped of their arrogance, stripped of everything that had once made them feel invincible, I found myself wondering if revenge would really taste as sweet as I had always imagined. I thought back to something Daniel Mercer had told me once, back when I was still learning what it meant to be successful, back when I was still trying to prove myself, back when I was still chasing the idea of winning at all costs. "Revenge," he had said, leaning back in his chair, his expression thoughtful, his voice steady, "doesn't taste as sweet as you think. You spend years working for it, dreaming about it, picturing the moment you finally get to watch them fall. And then, when it happens, you realize you wasted all that time chasing something that doesn't actually make you feel any better." I hadn't understood it then, hadn't been able to see past the need to prove myself. But now, sitting here, watching the two men who had once looked down on me finally understand what it felt like to be powerless, I finally understood what he had meant. I could let them fall. Or I could give them the second chance they had never given me. I didn't say anything right away, didn't give them an answer, didn't make a decision right then and there, because this wasn't something I could decide in a single moment. So instead I stood, pushing my chair back slowly, looking down at them, at the uncertainty in their eyes, at the way they were waiting for me to decide their fate. "I'll think about it," I said. And then I turned and walked away, leaving them to sit with the weight of the choice that wasn't just mine to make, but theirs to live with. Sitting behind my desk, I stared at the city skyline stretching beyond the glass windows, the sun casting long shadows across my office as the weight of the decision ahead of me settled deep into my bones. This was the moment everything had been leading up to, the moment I had spent years preparing for, The moment where I would finally decide whether I was the man who let them fall or the man who proved I was better than both of them combined. I had spent the past few days replaying every conversation, every memory, every insult, every dismissal, every moment where my father had made me feel like I would never be enough, every second where Lucas had basked in the praise that had never once been extended to me. And yet, even after everything they had done, even after all the years of being treated like an afterthought, I still couldn't shake the feeling that this choice would define me more than any success I had ever achieved. When the intercom on my desk buzzed, my assistant's voice came through, calm and professional, completely unaware of the history about to unfold behind these office doors. "Mr. Carter, your father and brother are here to see you." I took a slow breath, steadying myself, forcing my emotions into check, making sure that when they walked through that door, I would be the one in control, the one calling the shots, the one dictating the terms instead of the one left scrambling for scraps. "Send them in," I said, my voice even measured, carrying the authority I had spent years building. The door opened, and they stepped inside. Their presence so different from the last time I had seen them, their posture telling me everything before they even said a word. My father, once larger than life, once a man who had never entered a room without owning it, now looked small, his shoulders slightly hunched, his face lined with stress, his eyes scanning my office with a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that he no longer held the power in this dynamic. Lucas, on the other hand, still carried himself with a hint of the arrogance he had never quite let go of, still held his chin a little too high, still had that flicker of entitlement behind his eyes, even as desperation clung to him like a second skin. He had lost, that much was obvious, but unlike our father, he wasn't fully willing to admit it yet, wasn't fully willing to accept that the roles had changed, that the balance had shifted in ways he could never undo. I gestured for them to sit, watching as they moved carefully, watching as my father lowered himself into the chair across from me with a slow, almost reluctant motion, watching as Lucas leaned back slightly, trying to maintain whatever illusion of confidence he had left. I didn't speak right away, didn't offer them any reassurance, didn't make this easier for them because I wanted them to feel it, wanted them to understand what it was like to wait on someone else's decision, what it was like to have their future rest in the hands of a man they had spent years underestimating. "You've had some time to think," my father said after a moment. His voice quieter than I had ever heard it, lacking the usual weight it had always carried, lacking the sharp edge of authority that had once dictated every conversation between us. "I assume you've come to a decision." I studied him, studied the exhaustion in his features, studied the way his hands rested on his lap, fingers clasped together in a way that suggested he was bracing for disappointment, as if some part of him already knew that there was no coming back from this. Lucas, however, still had that flicker of impatience in his expression, still carried himself like he expected this to work out in his favor, still looked at me like I was the little brother he had always been one step ahead of, even when he was the one sitting in my office, waiting on my decision. I let the silence stretch, let them feel it, let them sit in the uncertainty before I finally leaned forward, my fingers resting against the polished surface of my desk, my voice steady when I spoke. "Why should I help you?" Lucas scoffed, rolling his eyes slightly, shaking his head as if the question itself was absurd, as if he still couldn't quite believe that he had to sit here and justify himself to me. "Come on, Noah, we're family," he said, his voice carrying that same tone he had always used when he thought he could charm his way through a situation. "We had our differences, sure, but you know how business is. Sometimes things don't work out. That doesn't mean we just let each other sink." I didn't react, didn't let him see the way his words made something cold settle in my chest, didn't let him see how much it disgusted me that even now, even at rock bottom, he still thought he could talk his way out of this. Instead, I turned my attention to our father, waiting, watching, wanting to see if he would say something different, if he would finally be the man I had always wanted him to be, if he would finally acknowledge that this wasn't just business, that this wasn't just about bad investments and failed deals, that this was about everything. "I know I made mistakes," my father said, and for a moment, I almost believed he was about to take responsibility, almost believed he was about to admit to everything, almost believed that he had finally learned something after losing everything. But then, he shook his head, sighing heavily, looking at me with an expression that wasn't quite regret, but something close enough to mimic it. "But at the end of the day, family is family. And if you turn your back on us now, you'll have to live with that." I exhaled slowly, my fingers tightening against the desk, my jaw clenching as I forced myself to stay calm, forced myself to remind myself that I was in control, forced myself not to let his words dig beneath my skin the way they once would have. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't acknowledging what he had done. He was warning me, trying to make me feel guilty, trying to manipulate me into believing that if I refused to help them, it would say more about me than it did about them. I looked at Lucas, at the remnants of arrogance still clinging to him, at the way he expected me to say yes because he had never known what it was like to be truly rejected. Then I looked at my father, at the weight of years of favoritism, dismissal, and disappointment etched into his face, at the way he still refused to see me as anything other than a resource to be used when it suited him. And then I made my choice. Before I could speak, before I could say the words that would either offer them salvation or confirm their downfall, my father shifted in his seat, exhaling slowly before he looked me in the eye and said something that made my entire body go still. "You remind me of myself," he murmured, his voice thoughtful, his expression unreadable, his eyes sharp in a way that sent a slow, unsettling chill down my spine. Always needing to prove something. Always needing to win. For the first time in years I felt something close to fear. Because as much as I wanted to deny it, as much as I wanted to believe that I had become something better, something stronger, something different, the truth was staring me in the face. Maybe I had spent so much time fighting to prove I wasn't like them that I had become exactly what I swore I never would. For a long time after my father spoke those words, I didn't say anything, didn't move, didn't even let my expression change because I knew that's what he wanted, knew that he was testing me, knew that he was watching to see if his carefully chosen words would shake me, if they would plant some seed of doubt deep enough to make me hesitate, deep enough to make me second-guess myself in a way that would work in his favor. I had spent years chasing success, chasing power, chasing the moment where I would finally stand above the people who had once looked down on me. And now that it was here, now that I was in control, I realized something that made my stomach turn in ways I hadn't expected. It didn't feel like I had won. I should have felt invincible, should have felt like I had finally proven myself, should have felt like this was the ultimate revenge, watching my father and brother sit in my office, waiting for my decision, powerless in a way they had never been before. But instead, I felt something colder, something heavier, something that made my fingers tighten against the desk as I realized that my father might have been right about one thing. I had spent so much time trying to prove that I wasn't like him that I had become something just as ruthless in the process. I took a slow breath, forcing my voice to stay steady, forcing my emotions to stay locked behind the same unshakable exterior I had built for myself over the years, refusing to let either of them see anything other than the version of me they had created, the version they had pushed me to become. "You need a job," I said finally, letting my words hang between us, watching the way Lucas tensed slightly, the way my father's expression remained carefully neutral, waiting to see which way the conversation was going to turn. "But what do I get out of it?" Lucas blinked, his lips pressing into a thin line, his jaw clenching like he was trying not to react, like he was fighting against the instinct to snap back, like he knew that whatever power he used to have in conversations like these was gone now. "You get to prove that you're better than us," he said, his voice even, his words carefully chosen, but I could hear the bitterness beneath them, could hear the frustration that came with needing me in a way he never thought he would. I almost laughed, almost let the irony of the situation sink into something sharp and satisfied, almost let myself enjoy the way it felt to have him sitting here, saying those words, offering himself up to me like I was the one with the final say in whether he sank or swam. But instead I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, watching them both, letting the silence stretch just long enough for them to start wondering if I was going to say no, just long enough for them to feel it. Then I made my choice. "You'll start at the bottom," I said, directing my gaze at Lucas, making sure he understood exactly what I was saying, making sure he knew there would be no shortcuts, no handouts, no easy way back to the top. No favors, no special treatment. If you want to prove that you deserve this, you're going to have to earn it. Lucas held my gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place, something that looked too much like resentment for my liking, something that made me wonder if giving him this chance was a mistake. But he nodded, slow and careful, and my father, for once in his life, said nothing at all. They left my office after that, Lucas walking a little too quickly, my father moving a little too slowly, and as I watched them disappear through the doors, something in my chest tightened in a way I couldn't quite explain, something that told me this wasn't over, something that told me I had made the wrong choice, even if I didn't know why yet. That night, when I got back to my apartment, there was an envelope waiting for me. No return address, no name, just a single folded piece of paper tucked beneath my door, weighted down with a kind of unsettling finality that made my stomach drop before I even reached for it. I unfolded it with careful fingers, my breath catching in my throat as I read the words scrawled across the page, my mind struggling to process them, my hands tightening against the edges of the letter as the reality of what I was looking at sank in. "You think you know who your father is, but there are worse things than a man who plays favorites. Check where the money really went before you decide if he deserves your mercy." I exhaled slowly, the words burning themselves into my brain, my pulse hammering in my ears as I turned the letter over, looking for anything else, looking for a signature, looking for some clue as to who had sent it, but there was nothing, just those simple, devastating sentences that made something inside me twist with the realization that I had just given a second chance to someone who might not deserve it at all. I spent the next few days digging, calling in favors, tracing financial records, pulling up files that I should have never been able to access, and the more I uncovered, the more I realized that my father hadn't just been bad at business. He had been corrupt in ways I hadn't even considered. Money laundering, fraud, backdoor deals that had made him a fortune while leaving other people ruined in his wake. Transactions that made it clear that he had never cared about anyone but himself. I stood outside my office that evening, watching the city lights flicker against the glass, my reflection staring back at me, the weight of everything I had just learned pressing down on me, suffocating in a way that no amount of power or success could erase. I had spent so much of my life waiting for this moment, waiting for the day when I would finally win, when I would finally be the one in control, when I would finally get to stand above my father and stepbrother and know without a doubt that I had proven them wrong. But now, standing here, knowing what I knew, knowing that I had just let him walk back into my world, knowing that I had just given him another chance, knowing that I had made this decision without knowing the full truth, I realized something that sent an unfamiliar chill through my veins. Maybe winning wasn't about proving them wrong. Maybe winning was about never becoming like them in the first place. I let out a slow breath, my fingers tightening around the edges of the letter, my mind racing with the implications of what I had just learned, my heart hammering with the knowledge that there were only two choices left in front of me. I could expose him, or I could let it go. Either way, I would have to live with it. Some people regret their mistakes. Others regret their mercy.